Thank you, Ben. Yes, I'm Joanna, Sarah, and we'll do it in this order. The project is part of a kind of book we are writing at the moment called Life After New Media. And we're trying to think about creativity in lots of different ways, beyond its traditional associations with Romanticism, neoliberalism, and the creative industries. And it's also an attempt to enact media as a set of processes of mediation. So I'll give a kind of 18-minute paper about the kind of theoretical framework for that notion of creativity, asking whether there is life in creativity as a concept as well as a kind of set of practices. And I'll try and show you as an entertainment bit a kind of 3-minute art piece that I've done a rough edit of from my own practice. And then Sarah will do her bit, which will be a reading of an instantiation of her process of mediation in a relationship between media, physics, and the universe. Okay. So the main aim of this talk is to reclaim creativity from many of its current contexts, predominantly those associated with Romanticism, neoliberalism, and what we may call for short, delusionism. Although let us make it clear right from the start that Deleuze is not our enemy here. Drawing on Henri Bergson's idea of creativity as developed in his Creative Evolution, we also propose the notion of mediation as a device for thinking about media events and inventions. Mediation stands for a set of entangled economic, cultural, social, technical, textual and psychological processes through which a variety of media forms develop in ways which are at times progressive and at times conservative. A discussion of creativity will therefore require a theory of decision to be able to make judgments about the progressivism and conservatism of various media inventions. Well, creativity, as you're probably suspecting at this stage, is a rather nebulous concept. One can hear in it echoes of the Latin word creatio, with associations of creation from nothing, in the way God is supposed to have created the world. The term is often linked with originality, with breaking new ground, and is variously explained by genius, divine intervention, or chance. Due to its conceptual openness, creativity has been claimed by various disciplines, from arts and humanities through to architecture and design, science, and economics. The incorporation of the language of creativity by the international business politics nexus under the umbrella of so-called creative industries is of particular concern to us because of the role new media played in this process of incorporation. In post-industrial capitalism, creativity has been repositioned as the driver of social and economic change. It has become a marketable commodity for the information age, in the same way that cars used to be in the Fordist era and coal was in the early industrial period. Although the idea of the creative industries was first introduced in Australia by Paul Keating's government at the beginning of the 1990s, it really came into its own in Tony Blair's Cool Britannia. Some of us might remember that. The model of creativity as a product in itself allowed for it to be exported to countries as diverse as Russia, Brazil, and China. Now, the economic and political limitations of the cultural industries paradigm have been well argued by critics such as Andrew Ross, Angela McRobbie, David Hesmonhalgh, Geert Loving, and Ned Rossiter. Got a few covers of the recent books dealing with this notion of creative and cultural industries. Such a repositioning of creativity is seen as having led to the proletarianization of the newly emergent creative class, the demise of viable independent cultural production, and the increased individualization of the creative labor force. It may therefore seem imprudent on our part to attempt to reclaim creativity as a viable strategy for thinking about the media differently. Yet it is precisely against the all-consuming power of creative industries' narratives and practices that we set out with our attempt to position creative media as an alternative paradigm for envisaging some new ways of thinking about and with the media. Of course, this is not to naively suggest a move beyond capitalism or economics, as questions of production, calculation and exchange are always at work within any sociocultural practices. Indeed, creativity is inevitably tied in with capitalism because in both its monetized and non-monetized forms, that is as music making, engineering, art or knitting, it participates in the intertwined processes of production, consumption and distribution through formal and informal communicative channels and networks made up of record labels, YouTube, publishing houses, manufacturing plants, computer systems, telephone exchanges and chats with friends. It is just the discussion of creativity through the creative industry's lens always seems to concede, as if in advance, the ownership of this concept to the creative industry's advocates. This consensus seems to be that the only way then to reuse creativity is by wrestling it away from the dominant economic framework and to outline a different, more socially aware, more collaborative economy. In the majority of these projects that are trying to think through or against the kind of creative industries paradigm, however, the emphasis is still very much on the analysis and critique of the particular creative industries, fashion, design, music production. Yet what if we were to mobilize the critical dimension of the analysis of creative media process and products and combine it with an actual attempt to produce creative media, while also subjecting the notion of critique to a critique? In other words, what if, rather than just write about the production of creative media by others, we could mobilize the very media that are being critiqued as objects of creative industries analyses, to put them to critical uses, to think with and through them about change, invention, and socio-cultural transformation. Tactical media projects in which cheap DIY media are used to criticize the dominant culture are perhaps an answer to such a demand. Examples of such tactical media projects include Creative Art Ensemble's Flesh Machine, a series of performances in which participants were invited to take donor screening tests and gather information about reproductive technology, as well as consider the socio-political aspects of such procedures, or Josh On and Future Farmers They Rule, a website which allows users to visualize intricate connections between Fortune 100 corporations and directions. So you go and you do your own map, and here somebody did a map of why Harvard doesn't fund alternative healthcare research. And if you were to zoom onto it, you would see the very close connections between different biotech companies and the insurance companies. Kind of answers. It's a kind of quite simple Marxist project in a kind of unveiling, revealing the kind of underlying. But I'm just showing you these two as examples of these kinds of tactical media. Yet in basing the rationale for their project on the dialectical relationship between the bad and critical mainstream and the good or critical oppositionality, many tactical media producers end up slipping, in the words of Caroline Bassett, into the romance of subcultural resistance. So, is it possible to invent new media otherwise, without falling back into such a dialectical model? Deleuze encourages us to go beyond the established schools that regulate the creative process in the arts and media, and to recapture the creative functions of the media themselves that transcend their author function. For Deleuze, the key issue today consists in reinventing, not simply for writing, but also for the cinema, the radio, the TV, and even for journalism, even is very interesting here, the creative or productive functions freed of this always reappearing author function. The creative impulse behind any such creative media comes to Deleuze, as much as it does to us, to me and Sarah, from the writings of Bergson, for whom creativity is about how reality produces effects in which it expands and transcends its own being. A vitalist to the core, Bergson derives this notion of creativity from the philosophical empirical observation of living organisms of various scales, and from their innate propensity for movement. With this in mind, could we envisage extending the creative agency of the critic-producer beyond individual or even collective creators to incorporate the creative potentiality of media themselves? That is, their ability to evolve and generate forms ever new. How could we achieve this critical creativity without transferring all responsibility for movement and change to the undifferentiated flow of life, or flow of electricity, flow of media? Indeed, post-Bergson, and especially post-Deleuze, it seems difficult for many theorists to talk about this movement and creative expansion of life without falling into rhetorical hubris. In many works inspired by vitalist philosophy, life tends to be positioned as a secular miracle, a sublime force that evokes both admiration and awe. There's quite a lot of work of this kind around at the moment. So when the philosopher Roberto Esposito, in his readings of nature, describes life as not knowing modes of being apart from those of its own strengthening, and as being ecstatically full of itself, he changes, with Nietzsche's help, the negative Darwinian, if not necessarily Darwin's, valorization of life as bearing an original deficit to its positive evaluation in terms of exuberance and prodigality. Similar effusiveness seems to be found in the writings of many others influenced by the philosophy of immanence to be found in life. Well, theoretical excursions into the natural sciences, and in particular molecular biology, often result in the rather gushing descriptions of life's force, energy and proclivity, with life redressed as the 18th century Casanova on the way to his desirous conquests. But what does it really mean to say that life is all-encompassing, that it is overcoming itself and pushing forward? Are all forms of life the same, and do they all have the same effectivities? Does this originary underlying layer called life actually exist? Or is this postulated unity of the plethora of natural variations and transformations constantly occurring in various organisms itself a fantasy? Is attempting to think creativity and emergence in the universe at different cosmic levels by drawing on genetic variation? In attempting to do this, many theories seem to have posited life as both an idea and ideal that has subsequently been used to provide a foundation for their particular philosophical framework, that is, an affirmative vitalist philosophy, a framework that requires this postulated multiplicitous unity as its conditioned. So in our attempt to find the conditions under which something new is produced, in other words, creativeness, we do take inspiration from Deleuze, and in particular from his reading in Bergsonism, of life as production, creation of differences. However, we also want to raise questions for such a positive valorization of life as of the creative force of life as a good in itself and as an adequate foundation for the philosophy of creativity. The redemption of desire by Deleuze and Guattari from its psychoanalytic associations with constraint and lack, and its reinscription as a positive force that is capable of enhancing the power of bodies and establishing connections between them, seems to entail a blind spot, the ascription to life's genetic push to expand and grow a value judgment and a meaning, and hence an interpretation that is otherwise decried in the Deleuzian philosophy. Even if we take desire, after Brian Massumi, as the intention-free unfolding of matter through time, it's impossible to separate this understanding from its particular temporary human incarnation, in the sense that what a patch of mould growing in our fridge desires is most likely rather different from our own desire, just as what we desired yesterday may be rather different from the desire that will drive us tomorrow. Perhaps if we stick with the more kind of narrow, specific and more vitalist understanding of desire as a push for life to expand, we could impose such a parallelism, which would also liberate us from the humanism of interpreting our own actions as being regulated primarily by volition. But then, even on Masumi's own terms, we cannot do just this, as he mobilizes the notion of desire to talk about the unfolding of the Australian artist's stellar artistic practice over time, a singular set of artistic interventions which may also include the element of the body evolving over time with and as machine, beyond the control of the artist, but which is not free from the artist's own interventions and judgments. Consequently, even if we were to concede that desire is both this and that, we have to agree with Hall and others when they say that not all forms of desire can be regarded as being psychologically or politically progressive. Some instances of the desiring field can be neoliberal, totalitarian, even fascist. How can we then judge which creative proliferations of desire are politically just and progressive, and thus capable of producing deterritorializing and blockages, psychologically and socially. On what basis, on what grounds can such judgments be made? We therefore want to propose that an affirmative vitalist philosophy needs to be exposed to a critique, unless it's prepared to disappear down its own metaphysical blind alleys, although rebranded as nature's corridors. So far from seeing critique as an unwelcome relic of certain types of academic and practices before the affective turn, whatever that is, we are positioning critique as a precondition of academic and artistic creativity. And criticality can save us from what we are terming creative mania, a desire-driven chase for originality that replicates the very structures and strictures of romantic creation, albeit now dressed in the language of materialist vitalist philosophy. And obviously, you're gathering hopefully by now that we're not speaking here against vitalist philosophy, but kind of trying to move alongside with it and through it and kind of interweaving some other kind of philosophical trajectories into it. Our own understanding of critique is partly derived from the work of Foucault, although we also want to raise questions for some of its humanist delimitations. Foucault's use of the term critique goes beyond its Kantian conceptualization in terms of recognizing the limits of knowledge and going against those limits. For Foucault, critique consists in putting constraints on or even refusing authority of the church, of scripture, of the law. It's the art of voluntary inservitude, which is focused on transforming the relations between power, subjectivity, and truth. Critique should be understood as more than fault-finding. It's first and foremost a creative practice that temporarily suspends judgment, but that ultimately requires a decision. If, according to Foucault, there is something in critique that is related to virtue, then critique also has a normative character. It enables making distinctions between states of being and encourages envisaging better, new states of being. In the words of Isabel Laurie, critique has a potential to initiate a recomposition. More than a theory of judgment or analysis of categories, critique can thus perhaps be understood as a theory of invention, even a theory of inventing well. We can see from this that any suspension of judgment can only ever be temporary, and that if we don't want to concede that any form of novelty and invention is good per se, that is, if we are not prepared to read any form of the mutation of life or technological invention as a good in itself, in advance, then we need to bring back a theory of decision of some kind. Drawing on Derrida's understanding of the relation between politics and undecidability, Hall and others argue that any decision with regard to a specific instance of media activism or creative proliferation of desire can't remain entirely open and incalculable. And just kind of choosing a bit the last bit from that quote, to make a responsible political decision, they say, it's necessary to respect both poles of the non-oppositional relation between the calculable and the incalculable, the knowable and the unknowable, the decidable and the undecidable, but then to make a leap of faith. So such a leap of faith in the space of a certain non-knowledge can perhaps serve as another name for a creative process that also remains critical which we are trying to envisage here. But who will these leaps of faith be made by? How can we account for the critical agency of that decision maker who temporarily cuts through this process of constant becoming in order to make a mark on life? In Foucault's critical attitude, it's still very much the human self that is the pivotal point of the transformation. The self's agency serves as a yardstick for evaluating change in the outside. Drawing on Foucault's notion of critical attitude, we want to propose a somewhat modulated term, critical attention, which stands not only for an ethical opening and an injunction to both receive well and produce well, but also for a mindful and corporeal disposition. It's a concept that makes more use of this entanglement between us and the world, or in Karen Barrett's words, to be entangled is not simply to be intertwined with another, as in the joining of separate entities, but to lack an independent, self-contained existence. Critical attention thus transcends human-centered intentionality by foregrounding the entangled state of agencies at work in any event. This is not to backtrack on what we earlier described as the theory of an inevitable but also somewhat impossible decision, at the heart of which always lies a leap of faith, or to deny singularly human ethico-political responsibility for any such events. But it is to acknowledge that what we are referring to as human is only a distinct entity in a relational, not an absolute sense, because, as Barad explains, agencies are only distinct in relation to their mutual entanglements. So wrapping up, any emergence of creative media will therefore always be a co-emergence in which we shall also take part and through which we shall also become something else. Yet even if we are hinting at the mutual co-constitution of the human and the world and the entanglement of the processes of natural and technical evolution, we are not suggesting here that media or art can grow like yeast, bacteria, or babies, and hence imposing an unproblematic parallelism between biological growth and cultural production. Critical attention as a material philosophical opening towards the emergence of the new is one way of guaranteeing that we will still be able to both tell the difference and make a difference. Stripped of its early associations of divine creation, creativity understood as an expansive force of life can therefore perhaps be positioned as a minimal condition for thinking about the world, its processes and entities. Another way of saying this is just consenting that life is, or that life is becoming, or that life is becoming, without drawing any particular conclusions or applying any a priori valorizations to this fact. This involves withholding any judgment on the positivity of its accumulation or unfolding, and the possibility of agreeing that life as such may not even exist. Although, of course, in particular circumstances and with relation to particular life processes and living beings, including most often, although not always, our own being, we may have to decide that such a becoming is desirable and that its diversification should be encouraged or not. However, it's not from within life as such that such a decision can ever be made. It can only come from bios, that is the organized life of a human who finds him or herself in the position of being able to ask such questions and make such valorizations, unstable, compromised, and temporary as they may be. Naturally, sometimes, most often perhaps, any decisions with regard to the expansion of life or its contraction will indeed be taken by life itself, by viruses, bacteria, cells. Yet these can only be described as decisions in a metaphorical sense and need to be differentiated from their perhaps rather rare, but not any less significant instances of human decisions about life, always taken in an undecidable terrain. And there's a kind of in-between, kind of bridge between my talk and Sarah's talk. I'll show you this art project, which is not an illustration of the work, but rather an attempt to think through sound and through images. So it's a way of doing philosophy as photography and as imaging.
To what extent is the pressure to be connected experienced by many bloggers and social networkers more than just an individualistic neoliberal imperative to align one's aims with those of the current politico-affected economy? Can blogging and social networking be positioned as a form of life, a vital practice of becoming with, in which pulsations of distributed bodies, keyboard strokes, flickering particles of electricity, and under-ocean cables constitute a different form of tissue culture? Many discussions of blogs today focus on their content without taking too much notice of the fact that the majority of blogs have only one reader, the blogger herself. But what if, rather than concentrate on what bloggers say, we were to look at what blogging does, treating it as a live practice through which human agency and human life are knowingly enacted in conjunction with technology. Blogs thus could perhaps become for us a form of live tissue culture. Interestingly, French philosopher Michel Foucault associates the practice of self-writing with an ethos of life. The keeping of individual notebooks and memory books focused on the recollection of the past is for him a matter of constituting a logos bioethikos for oneself, an ethics quite explicitly oriented by concern for the self toward objectives defined as withdrawing into oneself, getting in touch with oneself, relying on oneself, benefiting from and enjoying oneself. Foucault has in mind here something much more material and direct than just a story about one's life and how it should be lived. This practice of self-writing is said to produce a body. Drawing on Seneca, Foucault claims that writing transforms the things seen or heard into tissue and blood. From this perspective, diaries, blogs and online profiles present themselves not just as commentaries on someone's life, already lived to this point, but also somehow more real outside its narrative, but rather as materializations of it. Digital writing and linking is therefore not only a form of cultural production, but also a corporeal one. It literally produces the body by temporarily stabilizing it as a node in the network of forces and relations between multiple servers and computers, flows of data, users' eyes, fingers and sensations, particles of electricity. Immersed in the multi-layered folds of online spaces, we can trace the pulsating connections between images, text and code. In the visual tactility of blogs, we can also experience the web's lifeness.
Okay, so this is part 2, and what I'm going to do really is to try and put into action, if you like, this argument that Joanna was making here about the creative potentiality of media themselves. Okay, we're understanding media following Bolter and Grussin's book on remediation as both remediated objects and hybrid phenomena. So this talk links a little bit back to Catherine Hales, who kicked the whole thing off, Ben tells me, and who concluded with the argument that we need a concept that goes beyond remediation. So we're putting forward mediation as this concept that goes beyond remediation, drawing partly on them, recognising that it's an emergent term within new media studies, but still undeveloped. So mediation for us is the thing that signals the creative potentiality of media themselves. And I'm going to try and show you how it works in the context of the LHC project. So if I say LHC, yeah, good. It's the Large Hadron Collider, the Super Collider, still getting ready to recreate the Big Bang somewhere on the border between France and Switzerland. Okay, mediation works in this context, I'm suggesting, by both representing and performing the origin of life, the universe, and everything. So if the LHC project, the Big Bang project, is kind of cosmically creative, is created with a capital C, then creativity here as elsewhere involves this a process Joanna was talking about of differentiation, what Bergson and Derrida call the cut, which is seemingly organic, internal, which produces apparently autonomous entities, what I'll call enchanted objects, like protons, and TV presenters, Brian Cox, to name one. This process is also, if you like, something that happens from the outside, from the decision in this case to commodify part of the project's infrastructure known as the grid. So I don't know if you've heard of grid technologies, but grid can be, I'll say a little bit about it towards the end, not a lot, don't worry. Grid computing allows us, mainly forces us in this context to recognise that there can be no creativity without criticality. That we're including it as part of our critical attentiveness or attention, as Joanna said, and then apart from that, going with the flow. So the LHC project, as I said, is about recreating the Big Bang inside the world's largest ever super collider, having superseded Fermilab. As such, it is impressive. It's a fully scaled up automation of not a, but probably the cosmic event, right? and I don't wish to be peevish, but despite the recent trial runs, and you will have heard about these and seen these, the automated event of a particle collision, so particle physicists call a particle collision an event. The automated event of a particle collision at full energy, at full speed, hasn't yet happened. It hasn't yet occurred. It is still, if you like, pretty much wished for, but as you will have noticed, I'm sure it's been highly mediated from the launch date onwards. So the question for us is, what is mediation in this context? Yeah? What specifically is the relationship between the event and its mediation? So we're proposing that in this context, the entangled relationship between events and their mediation is highlighted because it's made extreme. Entanglement, Joanna mentioned, is a term used by Karen Barad, academic physicist, cultural theorist, to signify not the joining of separate things together, but the fact that things are never separate in the first place. Yeah? That there is no independent, self-contained existence. Existence, she says, is not an individual affair. By extrapolation, then, we'd say that events cannot exist outside of mediation. Events are always already mediated. In this project specifically, one in which the full event has not yet occurred and will be unrepresentable if and when it does, there is, if you like, more evidently than usual, no event independent of its multi-mediation by a whole range of agencies. I've just snuck in a few, including extremely big magnets, which you would have heard about because that's what went wrong in the first place. Screens, many, many, many screens. This is the control centre. They have television screens, computer screens, etc., etc. Particle physicist, here's one, just AN. And, of course, the average web user sitting in the library trying to figure the whole thing out. So the current status of this project, the LHC project, is a bit of a non-event, okay, so far. You will know that there was a switch on, there was a launch. This happened on the 10th of September 2008, followed, I think it was only 9 days later, by a somewhat ignominious switching off when the magnets kind of went horribly wrong and bang and everything. But it doesn't mean to say, in Baudrillard's sense, that this project is condemned to being a pseudo-event, not only one that hasn't yet taken place, but one that will not take place, yeah? Referring to Baudrillard's essays on the First Gulf War. We're going to suggest, on the contrary, that as a kind of mediated, ongoing, rather than just a media event, I don't have too much time to go into the difference and define for you what media events are, but media event is basically a one-off, live, launch-based, in this case, event. As opposed to that, a mediated event is continually taking place at the LHC. We might think of it as being virtually real. So the concept of mediation for us also cannot be equated with Baudrillard's concept of simulation, for the simple reason that its simulation is predicated on this split between the virtual and the real, which just does not hold up in a lot of contexts, including perhaps especially this one. So if for Baudrillard, the indivisibility of the event and its simulation in semiotic media signifies loss, devivification, the deterrence of the real, a disastrous interference in history. For us, switching metaphors, if you like, from implosion to entanglement, the relationship between the event and its mediation is kind of the very opposite. Not devivification, but some kind of distributed, as Joanna said, multi-agential, embodied vitality that broadly conforms to Bergson's notion of movement, duration, creative evolution, life itself. So what I'm suggesting is that the relation between the event and its mediation is paramount in this project, containing with it a whole set of other relations that can be seen as oppositions, like representation and performativity, space and time, information materiality, and liveness, understood as a kind of representational trope of media like television on the one hand, and liveliness, or life itself, on the other. But we want to sustain the question of relations, neither collapse nor oppose those phenomena. So we're drawing on Bergson's intuitive method, which is based on division, understanding things, taking them apart, and then putting them back together again, division and reconciliation. So this method is about figuring out what the real problem is, what's really at stake, and distinguishing between true and false problems, as he puts it. Distinguishing also between differences in degree and differences in kind, and finally taking time seriously. So what's really going on at the LHC? What's the actual problem? The stated problem, the one you know about, the one that's a feature of all its publicity, concerns the presence or absence of a full-scale particle collision and the subsequent appearance of this Higgs boson, this very elusive God particle. So the sciencey bit here is that the Higgs boson is a quantum of a field that, if it was present, would explain why some particles acquire mass and others do not. So lots of little particles racing across a field, some of them pick up mass, some do not. Why? They don't know. Okay? This is one of the big unanswered questions in physics. It's precisely the question of embodiment, rephrased for Radio 4 Today programme listeners on Big Bang Day during the launch, as the question of why the presenter John Humphreys is heavy. So why is John Humphreys heavy? Well, if we knew that, we would be able to reconcile the standard model of particle physics, which is the Bible of particle physics, with Einstein's general theory of relativity. Don't be worried, I'm not going there at all. The point is that the Higgs boson, if it was detected, would provide science basically with a theory of everything. It would unite or link the physics of extremely small things with the physics of planets. Currently, the physics of particles and planets don't talk to each other. The Higgs boson would basically sort that out. Okay? So it would afford them some kind of ultimate godlike knowledge, hence the veneration of this entirely hypothetical entity. However, if it exists, if it reappears in the fraction of a second following an automated event, then it will be so big in relative terms. Yeah, big for a particle, not that big, but big for a particle, and so unstable that it will disappear before it can be visualised by any known imaging technology. All that we can possibly detect at the LHC, they tell us, is the so-called smoking gun. Yeah? These kind of animated lines and traces radiating from a point on a computer screen that, by kind of representing something unrepresentable, is arguably already contributing to bringing about the event that it subsequently describes. Okay. The God particle will remain hypothetical in the sense of being outside representational knowledge and above representational knowledge. It is a God particle. Proof of its existence is going to be contingent on our faith in the objectivity of visual media. Yeah? Their ability to describe something from which they are allegedly epistemologically and ontologically separate. Okay? Presuming that our faith in this is at least combined with doubt in a contemporary secular teletechnologised culture, then the presence or absence of this elusive boson particle, God particle, must give way logically to the question of, or the true problem of, its mediation. So we're suggesting that mediation is a difference in kind from media. One of the things that makes it so is its temporal nature. Mediation for us is primarily a temporal, multi-agential phenomenon, a process, rather than a spatialising or spatialised object. But the division, we would suggest, and this is partly a critique of Bergson, is not absolute. The division between process and object is not absolute. And so when we're looking at the LHC as an event, we try to distinguish and to reconcile the LHC as a sort of one-off media event based in representation, based in liveness, and the LHC as an ongoing, mediated, if you like, non-event, characterised by its duration, its temporality, its liveliness. Time for Bergson is vitality, is liveliness, is life itself, but it isn't liveness understood as, again, a representational trope, an ideology, a sleight of hand, the illusion of movement of an object from A to B. Okay. But in this context, the illusion of movement is caught up with its actualisation, or to put it another way, the proliferation of live images, which have proliferated around the launch and other things, is both performative of cosmic life and a manifestation of its elusiveness. So, just to think for a minute about the LHC as a kind of time machine for enchanted objects, one of the ways in which the event there is mediated is through the website, is through animations like this, which I hope are going to work. Bear with me. Oop. There it is. I play this partly because it's one of my favourite things. Here. Here's an animation of what will happen at the LHC. This is a proton, I presume. Off it goes. going to get slingshot in one direction. The other one's going to get slingshot in the other direction. There we go. Accelerated now to pretty much the speed of light, actually pretty fast. And then inside this Atlas detector, wait for it. Bang. That's great. Well, at least it makes me happy. So, as these little proton bullets advance and collide, they transform, yes, into this brilliant display of radiating lines and colours, bursting out in all directions and actually appearing to break through, as you saw, to transcend the boundaries of this Atlas detector. I'm going to read that symbolically, if you like. This is the smoking gun. This is all there is ever going to be. It looks sometimes a bit like this as well. But this is all there's ever going to be, all the evidence we'll ever see of the Higgs boson, of the God particle, created by the collision of these seemingly autonomous, surprisingly in my mind at least endearing, proton bullets. Right? Even though the event has not happened yet, has not taken place yet, the Atlas detector has already performed, indeed in various animations continually performs its task of detecting the undetectable, so that all these screens in control centres in our homes, on TV, on the computer, can represent the unrepresentable. Now for Baudrillard, playing out a scenario before it can occur, which is what we're looking at here, playing out a scenario before it can occur empties the real event of significance, empties the real event of its originality. But unlike a war, which follows a war film, unlike a nuclear explosion, which follows a film about a nuclear explosion, there is here, in this context, no event of a collision-induced particle that is at all discernible in space and time from its animations, from its visualizations. Are these then, to quote Baudrillard, no more than a disastrous interference in history, brought about by the over-proximity, the implosion of the event and its mediation? Are these effectively deterrents of the real, or are they in some sense it? We would suggest that in a representational sense they are neither. Representationalism, to quote Barrett again, is the belief in the ontological distinction between representations and that which they purport to represent. Okay, specifically, what is represented is held to be utterly independent of all practices of representing. So representationalism presents us with seemingly autonomous entities like particles untouched by their mediation. Yes? Particles that, by virtue of being independent of scientific and other ways of seeing and knowing, can be represented, apparently, either more or less accurately. So the LHC project, not surprisingly, is over-invested in scientific representationalism, and therefore in the event as an object, as an autonomous thing, rather than a phenomenon or a process incorporating multiple agencies. A colleague and friend of mine, Lucy Sushma, would suggest that what happens in events like this is that the multiple agencies involved, I showed you some of them, kind of are obscured, elided, through this kind of fetishization or overinvestment in the object, in this case the proton. Right? The event as object or thing has a beginning, a bang, has an end, a universe. And it can be represented in science and the media because allegedly it preceded the intervention of science and the media. Ultimately it becomes, to use the anthropologist Alfred Gell's term, enchanted or elevated, says Lucy, to the status of something that is, something that has effects, rather than being seen as an effect in itself. There is much enchantment going on at the LHC, okay? Not just in visual images like these, but in verbal images as well. The website contains a long list of enchanting facts, ranging from the sublime to the ridiculous. I'll read you just the ridiculous at the bottom. Part of the LHC will be the world's largest fridge. It could hold 150,000 fridges full of sausages at a temperature colder than deep outer space. It goes on and on and on. There are many, many pages of facts like this on the website. Protons, as we just saw, are particularly daring and kind of a bit heroic as they whiz around this circuit all by themselves. They become anthropomorphically interchangeable with people. When protons arrive at the LHC, I can't quite get past that. How do protons arrive at the LHC? Do they walk? Do they get the bus? I don't know. But they're travelling at nearly the speed of light. Each proton goes around the ring over 11,000 times a second. I hope it's got a crash hat. This is going to go very, very fast. A nominal proton beam at the LHC will have an energy equivalent to a person in a Subaru driving at 1,700 kilometres per hour. Well, I hope they have a crash hat too. In place of representationalism then, and its enchanted kind of proton person type objects, Barad turns to a notion of performativity, which applies to the natural world as well as to the social world. She says, performative approaches call into question representationalism's claim that there are representations on the one hand and ontologically separate entities awaiting representation on the other. They focus inquiry on the practices or performances of representing, as well as the productive effects of those practices and the conditions for their efficacy. Well, then the question for us is, what are the productive effects of the LHC's representing practices? To what extent are they helping to bring about the event that they subsequently describe? So a performative account of science, and indeed of the media, will take into account that knowing, if you like, does not come from standing at a distance, from standing back and representing, but actually from what Barad terms a direct material engagement with the world. Again, what then is the nature of these direct material engagements? In this context, we might think then of particles not as a given thing, but as something created, something generated, something produced experimentally, as well as visually, as entities, produced as entities as well as images, by a Cartesian habit of mind, which isolates and atomizes and divides things along a subject-object axis. And Bergson is critical of what he calls this intellectual tendency, which by cutting out objects from processes transforms that which moves into that which is static, transforms temporality into spatiality. Okay. So a particle then is not necessarily a given. It's not necessarily something that is and has effects, but it is in itself an effect of a habit of mind. For Bergson, we can change this habit of mind by thinking more intuitively, less intellectually, more in terms of our agential connection, our relationality with the world around us, rather than our supposed autonomy within it. Anthropomorphism, of course, is predicated on an illusion of autonomy. The productive effects then of the LHC's representing practices is to both repeat that intellectual Cartesian habit of mind, but also to challenge it by taking us back to the beginning of time. Okay? So if the Large Hadron Collider itself is kind of like a time machine for enchanted objects, their visualization, their animation plays out the possibility that something else could happen, plays out the possibility that they could transcend, elude detection, or, if you like, current and future forms of representational knowledge. So if, as Baudrillard suggests, the playing out of a programmed event, and that is all we have seen at the LHC, the playing out of a programmed event, he says, cannot constitute its occurrence. What we're suggesting is that it can co-constitute its occurrence. And in this way, the animation of a particle collision, itself merely a manifestation of liveness, an illusion of movement, etc., an instance of representationalism, it actually becomes a vital part of its automation. And instead of constituting some kind of disastrous interference in history, it contributes to the constitution of its metamorphosis in and through technological forms. Our point is this, that the stage for inaction of events, or the action or inaction of events, including but not exclusively the LHC, we might think about, and we have thought about, the credit crunch, for example, or the flu pandemic, or the Iranian post-election protests. Yeah? The stage for the action of these events has been expanded, has been transformed, but has not been removed. Right? Events are not imploded in media, we suggest. They are transformed through mediation. Mediation doesn't posit some kind of reciprocal end game. Baudrillard talks about the dissolution of TV in life and the dissolution of life in TV. Okay? Actually, mediation for us posits some kind of more productive relationality that isn't an endpoint in history, but part of its creative evolution, referring back to Bergson's term, which is fine. But Joanna is keen to point out that it's not enough, it would be a mistake if we were to read mediation as creative evolution uncritically, as some kind of becoming without limits, to quote Braidotti, as process without stasis, as something inherently progressive, and that is not what we're saying. But it does bring me back to Brian Cox, which makes me happy. Brian Cox is now the face of the LHC, yes, the BBC's presenter. And he was, as you probably know, former keyboard player for Derrida, which is a band, and therefore partly responsible for the Labour Party's successful 1997 election anthem. Oops, it didn't quite get better for them at all. But, you know, Brian Cox, he believes in progress. Things can only get better. So he's rewarded with all this kind of his celebrity status. He's the face of the LHC. He's the face of other scientific wonders that have recently been aired on BBC Two. You may have seen them. But in the absence of an actually unfolding live televisual event of a Big Bang, in the face of this bit of a damp squib at CERN in Switzerland, even during the launch, which I'm sure some of you watched at least, when no one really knew what was happening, when Andrew Marr was at a loss, when there was really nothing to see, Brian Cox, ex-pop star, gives us something never less than cheerful to look at. And here he is on his moped racing around the LHC circuit, which you saw the protons going around earlier. And to my mind, he becomes a bit interchangeable with them, these happy little protons with their helmets on. Off they go. He absolutely adores his job as a physicist. He enunciates the 16 particles of the standard model with complete love and attention, is effectively able to narrate the impasse in physics, and is very, 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 very excited at the prospect of discovering the Higgs boson at the LHC. He's even more excited by the prospect that it will not be discovered at the LHC and therefore doesn't exist. And this is thrilling because it would provoke a revolution in physics. It would demand new science and possibly a new kind of science. Right? So he, along with his colleagues at the LHC, stands more than ready to break with his habits of mind. Okay? So if the God particle would join together their intractable scientific models and complete their intellectual knowledge of life, the universe and everything, from his point of view, long may it continue to elude them. Okay? And that seems likely, according to this documentary, since physicists don't really know what particles are. Are they points in space? Are they extensions in time? What if particles were more like strings? This is a question raised in the project. What if particles were more like strings? Well, then they would be amenable to gravity. Gravity is the force that underlines Einstein's theory of relativity, but would literally explode the standard model of particle physics. Okay? String theory, then, like the Higgs boson, could theoretically unite their two scientific models, except that strings are so unimaginably small that it is impossible, apparently, to build a collider big enough to detect them. So strings, the existence of superstrings, is completely beyond representational knowledge, even by means of the smoking gun. Okay? It is acknowledged that string theory is more metaphysics than physics, that it's a kind of intuitive philosophy rather than intellectual philosophy, based on a sense of wanting to get a bit closer to life, to connect with it, but not necessarily to conquer it through scientific knowledge. So its presence in this project signifies creativity, it signifies open-endedness, experimentalism, non-utility, the sense that the whole thing was designed and funded and executed for the sake of pure knowledge. Okay? And that's an existing claim within the project, but it's counteracted by the LHC's, if you like, darker, more sinister subplot, namely the development of the worldwide LHC computing grid. The grid is defined then as a kind of global distributed model of data storage and analysis. What it means is that this project needs to decentralize, needs to disperse its computing, because it will generate more information than it can possibly deal with by itself. And they've developed the grid technology in order to handle that. It's supposed to be the successor to the web. The web's was also developed at CERN in Switzerland, same place. Of course, we didn't know what the web was going to do in terms of the future, but there are definite predictions about what grid technology will do. The idea at the moment is that it will turn computing into a utility like gas, like electricity, and that this will be affected by a new layer of computing called middleware, which will sit between operating system software and application software. And this layer is what's going to enable internet access to be commodified and regulated, this time through far more closed automated systems of tracking and security that are expressly designed to prevent the free flow of information, to prevent file sharing, to prevent the activities associated with, I quote, malicious hackers. Okay? So at the moment they're trying to standardise grid computing so that businesses can use it, so that government investors can use it, and scientists at universities can use it to promote themselves, to sell stuff to us. So grid technology is continuous with, if you like, the marketisation of the internet, which itself put pay to the internet's early utopian promise that it was going to be some kind of virtual life form. Do you remember that? Autonomous, self-evolving, self-regulating, non-organic system. Marketisation did for that. The grid technology coming out of CERN is continuous with that, but not with the LHC's claim to creativity, not with the LHC's, if you like, more intuitive, less intellectual philosophy of life. Okay, so the moral of the story, if you like, is more critical attention, especially in the face of the generative potentiality of mediation at the LHC. Okay, I'm done.